Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So this week's topic, we're going to be actually reviewing some of you guys' writing that you guys have submitted. So, so basically, I'll be taking a look at some of the writing that you guys have submitted through either the writing critique form or the homework submission form. And all of these are from you guys who opted to be featured. So basically, I'll be taking a look at some of you guys' work and explaining some of the things that you guys do really well and a few things that you guys might want to consider working on and taking as suggestions. And I'll be working kind of through a document, and I'll be able to I'll share the writing with you guys so that even for all of you at home that did not submit something, hopefully you'll still be able to learn something from seeing other people's writing get critiqued. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first piece that I'm going to be looking at is called Apple and the Large Giant. And just to clarify, kind of as a disclaimer, for those of you that opted to remain anonymous, obviously to respect you guys' privacy, your name will not be shared. So if there is no name on the document, that is why. So, okay. So first, I'm going to go ahead and read this kind of short story so you guys can kind of see it as well. The apple was alone in the world of large giants, with no companions or place to call home. It was the large giant's fault that the apple's family was gone, but what could the apple do? The large giants ruled the world before the apple kind ever existed. They were disgusting and immoral creatures, grasping innocent apples and gnawing into them savagely, then tossing its remains for the deceased apple's friends and family to weep and mourn the loss of the eaten apple. The apple kind could do nothing about it, for being connected to the tree from the head, and being disconnected meant death, or so the apple's mother revealed. That fateful day when the apple decided to test the mother's theory was the day that the apple's family and friends left the world to apple heaven to live peacefully. The apple was childish and premature that day and wanted to see the world, dismissing the chance of the large giants eating the apple. The apple had never seen a large giant before, and the apple thought that it wouldn't ever see him, the false sense of security that led to the apple being left in the cruel world. Over the next few years, the apple rolled past grassy fields and sighted many large giants. The apple thought that they were quite peculiar, especially keeping a furry creature 20 times the apple's size around. A large giant would throw a flat disc, then the furry creature would return it back to the large giant. The apple thought that it was both fearless and idiotic, sending back the item that the large giant wanted to discard, and following the large giant around, ignorant of the horrors that the large giant did to the apple kind. The apple wanted to warn the furry creature of the large giant, but the furry creature didn't understand, cocking its head and placing its smelly jaws onto the apple, and carrying it to the large giant itself. The apple nearly cried from the action, the apple risking its life for the furry creature, and it repays the apple by bringing it to the large giant. What kind of torture did the large giant have for me, the apple wondered. The large giant saw what was in the furry creature's maw and reached for the apple. Suddenly, water leaked from the sky, and the furry creature dropped the apple and ran toward the large giant, who was seeking shelter from the droplets of water. Never had the apple been so grateful for rain, and the apple made sure to never be near any large giant or anything associated with it ever again. Wow, I think this is a pretty interesting story. Right off the bat, when I first read this, some of my first thoughts were like, I like the way that this is in the perspective of something that is a character that is not human. And oftentimes in books, when the narrator is not human, it's usually in the form of like an elf or like some magical being or even an animal. But in this case, we get something pretty interesting and kind of funny, which is an apple. Which is literally a fruit, which by normal society standards is an inanimate object and food and nothing else. So that's pretty interesting. I'll be honest, when I first read this, it actually took me a while to see that the large giants are actually humans. So we're kind of seeing the apple's perspective in this kind of fantasy world where apples are sentient. So first, let's go kind of back, and I'm going to review some of the comments that I had that I've written down while considering this piece. So first of all, starting here from the beginning, when we say the apple was alone in the world of large giants, with no companions or place to call home. Here, this raises some questions that I think you could go a little deeper into characterization. For example, we get a sense, of course, that we say later that the apple was childish and premature. But we can go a little more into his personality and evidence that supports this. It'd be kind of interesting to see maybe some of the apple's previous memories or flashbacks that kind of show that he was like kind of a rebel since he was created or born. I don't exactly know how apples are born, but to kind of see like a kind of history or backstory to this apple, as well as maybe how his upbringing affected that, because even apples should have probably some kind of past. And as I go, for you guys, and also for the person who wrote this, I'm going to go ahead and leave comments here so that you guys can follow along. So basically, I'm kind of curious about, this kind of raises questions about characterization. So basically showing a little bit more about this apple character. Moving on, so continuing, I really like the way here you say, the way you actually describe the large giants, which are actually humans. They were disgusting and immoral creatures, grasping innocent apples and gnawing into them savagely, and then tossing its remains for the deceased apple's friends and family to weep and mourn the loss of the eaten apple. These, even though of course the language is kind of undermining or like making the humans out to seem like disgusting creatures, I think the language itself is actually really well done. I like kind of the flow of the whole sentence, the way you use commas to like kind of emphasize on top of all these bad characteristics together, and also just kind of the imagery of it, right? Not just that they're discussing an immoral, but you actually go into detail showing why, right? Like this is a very sensory thing that we can visualize, grasping innocent apples and then gnawing into them savagely. I mean, they toss the remains for like the relatives to weep over. So this is really well done. This here is just a kind of a really great, it's just a really great sensory description that allows the reader to visualize everything. Continuing on. So when we continue here, we learn a little bit more about like the apple kind and what they think about, but there are some gaps missing, I think, where you might be able to go into more detail about what this means. For example, when we continue here, we say that fateful day when the apple decided to test the mother's theory was the day that the apple's family and friends left the world to apple heaven to live peacefully. So based on this sentence, my interpretation was that this implied that the apple's family and friends are dead, because you say the apple's family and friends left the world to apple heaven to live peacefully. However, we don't really understand, well, first of all, it's not really explained why exactly what happened to them specifically. Were they also eaten by large giants, or what other consequences might have befallen them? And also, it makes me curious to see our narrator, the apple's actual emotional reaction to this, because like, did the apple mourn for his family? I assume so. Like, what did he do afterward? Did this not make the apple like more cautious about the large giants if they were eaten by them? It's like kind of what actually happened. So this kind of raises questions of like what actually happened and how did the apple react? So those are a few questions that you might consider going into a little more detail about. So continuing here, I really like the way you give this description of kind of characterizing the apple a little more, because again, mentioning this childish and premature gives us the idea that this apple doesn't really know how to follow the rules, and dismissing the chance of ever eating the apple. And this idea of the false sense of security, I really like that use of that phrase, because it also shows a little bit about the apple's past, that he hasn't really encountered this kinds of danger. So this is kind of like a nice turn of phrase that kind of shows us how the apple really views the situation. He doesn't actually know the danger that the large giants present. So this here is like a nice way of showing the apple's perspective. Okay, so continuing here, we kind of see some sensory description of what the apple sees over the next few years. He kind of sees like the large giants, what they're doing. And I kind of thought this is actually kind of funny, seeing like an apple's view of what a human and a dog playing together looks like. Yeah, I thought that was actually really interesting, because it's called, it's referred to here as like a furry creature that throws a disc back and forth between the human, which I assumed to be like the human and a dog playing frisbee. And of course, this is the apple's perspective. So the apple views this as, I thought this was funny, that the apple thinks that the dog is like kind of fearless and idiotic for risking the danger with this large giant. So I thought this is also a really nice way of connecting to the audience or the human readers as well. Because of course, as a reader, we can connect to this because most of us have generally seen like people and dogs playing together. So we kind of And also this slowly since the beginning, we kind of get more and more clues of what the large giant actually is, which is not some mythical beast, but really just a human. So this sentence here, which kind of tips the readers off even more, this is kind of a great way of kind of also connecting to the readers and showcasing a more familiar human element. Since that kind of gives us an idea of what like from our perspective of what this looks like, which is just a human and a dog playing together, versus what the apple sees. Continuing here, again, this contrast of fearless and idiotic is really nice because it's the idea that the apple thinks, well, of course, this dog has bravery if he's willing to like approach the large giant and like have these objects with him, and also kind of stupid since like self-preservation wise, he should probably be trying to run away from the large giant. So this is a kind of nice job using like contrasting adjectives to give us a sense of how the apple sees the dog. So continuing here, we kind of see the apple's thoughts about wanting to warn the large giant. The dog doesn't understand, of course, since he views himself, since the two of them are companions. And then here at the end, we see, here kind of what I see is like the climax of the story where the apple is taken, or the apple's like picked up by the large giant and he's going to be eaten. He asks like, what kind of torture did the large giant have for me? I think here, you can probably, this is already pretty good asking these questions in the apple's head, but I think you could go even a little deeper than this into the apple's thoughts and emotions. Maybe he flashes back to what happens to his family. Like maybe he's like kind of even emphasize his emotional state even more, because this is like the big moment. Kind of even slowing this down a little bit. Kind of last week during plot, we talked about pacing. And since this is kind of the big moment in the story, slowing this down, showing the apple's fear and apprehension would be a really nice touch here. So I think you could go kind of deeper into the apple's thoughts and emotions here. So continuing, and then of course we have kind of the falling action / resolution here. So it is, so rain falls from the sky, and luckily for the apple, the dog and the human run to go find shelter, so the apple is saved and gets to live another day. And again, nice job here using figurative language, saying water leaked from the sky rather than just saying it started to rain. One thing I would comment though, here at the end, of course, we do see that the apple is of course relieved that he has not been eaten, but I still think this ending here could be like, I think this ending is still a little bit quick. We just have this kind of one sentence that says the apple made sure to never go near the humans again. But I feel like this could be made even fuller and more satisfying. There are other questions that you might consider, like again going deeper into the apple's like emotional state, and kind of what happened afterward. Like, did the apple go on to like did he try to like warn other apples after his like adventures, or did he just live in solitude? Kind of just a few questions about maybe what happened afterward. Although this is true that this is a short story, so if you don't really want to get into what happens later, that is also totally fine. So yeah, overall, great job writing this story. I think this is actually really fun and kind of an interesting take on the perspective of what we just consider to be an inanimate fruit. So yeah, great job with this. And by the way, for those of you that, oh, and yes, one last thing though, as I think someone mentioned in the chat, this is a great story. One thing you also could consider is breaking this up into paragraphs, because as a reader, it is kind of hard for us to keep track of everything going down one giant chunk of text. So maybe splitting things up. We'll discuss a little bit more later in some of the other stories about paragraph structure, how that can be used for like to make other things more effective. But basically, it can be a little, first of all, easier on your reader's eyes, and also actually emphasize certain lines of text when certain lines are brought out on their own. So yeah, consider that. But yeah, overall, great job. And remember that if you guys ever have any questions in the chat, even if it's not your story, you can still ask questions about any of my comments if you think you need clarification or if it'll help you understand something better. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next story. Okay, so this next one I'm gonna look at is just kind of a quick, this one's pretty short. It's just the introduction to what I assume would be a longer story. So we have an opening paragraph here. And I'm going to first go ahead and read it for you guys. I quickly stumbled forward as the rock around me began to cave in. The wooden trusses and foundation supporting the mine had collapsed as rock crashed from the ceiling. I quickly sprinted back to the entrance. However, standing before me was a fiery pit of lava. Rock sunk into the lava, melting in a split second. With the mine caving in from behind me and a blazing pool of lava before me, I had no choice. I took a huge leap over the lava, clasping onto a nearby ledge. Pulling myself up, I raced to the entrance where the rest of the survivors stood before me. Yeah, so this is kind of like a big action opening scene. It kind of feels like almost movie-like or film-like, where we see like a lot happening at once. This character is running. We have a lot of unanswered questions, but of course, this is kind of an opening paragraph, so that is to be expected. I think a lot of this story, one thing I wanted to mention later is going to be related to pacing. But first, sorry, one second. Okay. So first of all here, one thing you might consider throughout this whole thing is playing around with sentence length. Sentence length can be used to play around with pacing in general to make a story feel longer to make something feel faster, like the story is moving faster or slower. And of course, during certain events, you want things to slow down so we can see and focus on the character's thoughts and actions and emotions, versus in other situations, we just want things to be a blur, either to skim over them because they are irrelevant or because we want things to feel super fast paced. To give an example, I actually prepared a quick thing to explain what I mean. So this is basically so here, I just took a quote, which is just starting from like here all the way to here. So this is just a quote from here. So as you can see, a lot of the sentences here, although you do a really great job kind of looking at these sensory details, one thing that you could consider is playing around with sentence length. So as an example, I kind of rewrote this. I kind of like played around with an alternative version of this, where we used shorter sentences and occasionally fragments to make things feel faster. So as a comparison, as you can see, some of these sentences are usually more medium length. Of course, while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And in fact, this can be used to your advantage. Something to consider is using fragments. So this is what this alternative version kind of looks like. The ceiling starts to shake. I scan my surroundings in a panic. Jagged rock, gray dust, nowhere to run, nowhere to go. I race back to the cave's entrance before the blazing pit of lava that hisses and steams. Its thick smoke and roaring flames mean certain death, but I have no alternative. So the difference between these two, or at least one part of it, is notice that these little fragments here, and even the beginning here, the ceiling starts to shake. It's a very short, quick thing. There's not too much description. You're kind of giving a little bit more opportunities for like the reader to fill in the blanks with their own imagination. But fragments like this can sometimes make the story feel faster, like the narrator themselves is like looking around, scanning their surroundings. It gives us the impression that this is like more fast-paced and like zoomed in into one moment. So kind of playing around with that could be something to consider. I really like, in going back to your original though, as I mentioned before, you do a really good job with sensory details here, like wooden trusses foundation, and then you see rock crashing from the ceiling. We see fiery pit of lava, like the mine caving in, the blazing pool, like all these small things add up. One thing though, you do use a lot of visual things. You might also want to consider like other parts of this. Like for example, when we talk about a blazing pit of lava, of course, like there's the appearance of it with like the orange and red flames or however it looks, but also usually in front of lava, one thing to consider is temperature, because this is probably going to be really hot. It's like searing hot. Perhaps the narrator feels like the heat against their skin. Perhaps it's really stuffy and uncomfortable. Perhaps it feels like their lungs are burning, like from the smoke. Basically consider all the elements, including all 5 senses. It probably smells awful in here, I assume, if there's like rock crashing from the ceiling and only like a pit of lava in front. And of course, the air probably feels thick, smoky, uncomfortable. So consider all 5 senses. Although, of course, you already do a good job with visuals, so just consider the other ones too. Continuing on, you also do a good job making this have like a sense of intensity. So one big thing about setting is atmosphere. And you do a really good job building atmosphere. Obviously here we get the sense that there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of like intensity here. The narrator is in a high pressure situation. And I think you did a great job kind of showing that with all these like details and the idea that the narrator has no choice. I am curious though, of course, when you mentioned I raced to the entrance where the rest of the survivors stood before me. This obviously opens up a lot of opportunities, and it makes you wonder, like, who are these survivors? What really happened here? And I'm assuming if this story were to be expanded upon, those are the kinds of questions that I would consider. And one final detail here, when you take a huge leap over the lava, this is a big moment, right? So consider, sorry that I haven't been, I'm sorry, leaving as many written comments, but consider slowing this down, because as he jumps, of course, in real life, a jump probably is very fast. In that moment in real life, it would probably this would probably take just like a couple seconds, or at least maybe like 5 seconds, depending on the gap. But in a story, of course, one of the magic of storytelling is that you can slow that moment down with words. You can kind of expand it, focus on like how the narrator is breathing, focus on like the area around them, even more sensory details. Maybe they're like maybe their legs are burning from the impact, all the energy. Basically all these tiny things that the narrator might notice as they're falling through the air in this super dramatic moment. So slow this down both with sensory and with like maybe longer sentences or shorter sentences, whatever you feel would make the atmosphere and pacing work. So overall, definitely really great job with this story. This seems super exciting, and again, kind of like the start of a movie. Okay. And again, you guys, if you have any questions, then feel free to leave them either in the chat or the Q&A. Okay, so the next one I'm going to look at. This one here is called The Freaks. So this one is a bit of kind of like a dystopia almost, or kind of like a post-apocalyptic kind of thing. So yeah, quite interesting. Give me a second. Okay. Okay, so first I'm going to go ahead and read this excerpt to you guys to give you an idea of what the story looks like. It's been a long time since I've seen anyone else. The loneliness never really goes away. I've been out here in the barren desert, barely surviving on my own for more than 5 years now, and I've never run into another human. It wasn't like this before the fall. Back then, the blue sky wasn't entirely covered by gray fog. Back then, there were trees and grasses and clouds. Now, the only thing you find out here is sand, skulls, and the remains of human civilizations. And then there are the freaks, grotesque-looking monsters that have purple skin, wiggling appendages, long horns, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes. They seem to dwell in the most random locations, from inside small caves to walking around in the desert. And they always walk alone. They seem to wander from place to place, their long tails dragging behind them. And after feeling the same way for so long, I can see the loneliness on their faces. But I found that as long as you don't bother them, they won't bother you. Yet perhaps the strangest thing that they all do is that they slowly walk west toward the setting sun. I didn't notice it at first, but eventually I noticed that they all seem to have a singular, resigned purpose to slowly trek in that direction. Eventually, I started to walk that way too. It seemed that the freaks had a destination, somewhere they felt compelled to go to. That was one more destination than I'd had. Sometimes, though, I wonder if there really is a final location that we're all walking to, if there's really an end, or if we're just really destined to walk along the endless sand forever, the land around devoid of all color. But one day, as I slowly marched west once more, I began to notice something odd. The ruins of humanity around me began to look more and more real. In the past, I'd only passed by random bits of large scrap metal strewn across the desert, and sometimes the rotting carcass of a freak. Now, however, the metal started to take some sort of shape. I saw a huge piece of metal that almost looked exactly like a giant robot's head, another that seemed to once be part of a giant ship, and another that had to be the parts of a large computer. The strangest thing, though, was that the rust on these pieces of metal seemed fresh. As I continued walking, my heart began to beat faster and faster. I didn't know exactly what these findings meant, but oh, I hoped. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, I might find others. Was there really a chance that after so long, I could finally talk to another human being, to know that I wasn't alone in my misery? That after so long, I could finally cure the dull ache of loneliness in my heart? And as I finally trekked to the top of an enormous mountain of sand, I felt my heart finally stop in my chest. In front of me, I saw a huge city, protected by enormous metal walls on all sides. But from my vantage point on the mountain, I could see people, real, actual people. I can feel a tear starting to slide down my cheek as I slowly walk toward the huge city, Whether in happiness or sadness, I don't even know. And while the city's giant walls might loom over me, I can see the promise of companionship, of safety, of happiness they offer. But then a loud bang breaks the silence of the night, and I let out a silent scream as I fall down, my leg erupting in pain. And as I lay immobilized on the floor, I can see the lights of the city above, tantalizingly close, yet at the same time completely out of reach. I am the protector of the lost city, a robotic voice whispers quietly from behind me, a place where the freaks cannot go. There's nothing I can do as it drives a knife through my crying, bleeding heart, and the world goes black. So wow, this is very intense and quite interesting. So yeah, this kind of has the vibes of like a very apocalyptic, sorry, I cannot talk, but kind of like the idea of like this future society where like the world has been destroyed. We're left with like these monsters called freaks that like roam the city. And yes, this ending is very intense and of course leaves some questions, but this is extremely intense because the narrator, our protagonist that we kind of almost sympathize for at the end, ends up dead. So let's go ahead and go back. Right, it is kind of like a cliffhanger. It's quite interesting. So first, I'm going to go ahead and look a little back at the beginning. So, right, he was a freak. It's kind of like a plot twist. So starting from the beginning here, this so this opening line I think is very strong. It's been a long time since I've seen anyone else. Again, it's kind of the way it's separated from the rest of the text. It's like it starts here and then we move forward. So it kind of introduces, it gets the idea. We kind of already get a sense of what kind of genre we're about to see here, just from that opening sentence. So this is a very, so this is a nice strong opening, and we see foreshadowing about this world. And of course, it gets the reader's attention. And then we see a little bit more into this. The loneliness never really goes away, the barren desert. And they've barely been surviving on their own for more than 5 years now. Of course, this does raise a question about kind of like, it does make me wonder how they survived though. Because, or at least kind of going more into this, because the idea in my head was that this is kind of like a barren desert, which I assume means that there's not much food, especially if everything was like destroyed in some major like huge world destroying event. So I'm assuming there's probably not much food or even life around this area in general if this character has never run into another human. So how exactly did they survive? Maybe go a little more into that. Did they have help of some form? Because even I'm assuming that this person needs food and water. So then we see it wasn't like this before the fall. Back then, the blue sky wasn't entirely covered by gray fog. Back then, there were trees and grasses and clouds. So here, nice job using parallel structure. Because again, we see this emphasis on back then, kind of gives us this sense of rhythm. And again, using the description of like how this is also a comparison between what happened before and after this I'm assuming historical event called the fall, which I'm assuming led to this world becoming like this barren wasteland. And now the only thing we find is sand, skulls, and the remains of human civilizations. So that's pretty interesting. Although of course throughout the story, though, we never really get that much details on what happens on the fall. So if this were to be a longer story, if you were to expand on this, one question I might consider was details about like the fall and like how were the freaks created? Like what really happened to lead to the event where the freaks were like, there's now two species almost like of freaks and humans. Like what really happened to create these like horrible monsters? So we continue here where we learn about the freaks and some description about them. So I really like the way you use this description here. These are some really great sensory details. Again, we see grotesquely monstrous purple skin, wiggling appendages, long horns, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes. So obviously these are some undesirable qualities by our current societal standards, but we get a very clear picture of what you're talking about and these monsters that now dwell in locations and they wander alone. And also, so yeah, and now this next sentence is quite interesting because we say they wander alone, and then here we have, after feeling the same way for so long, I can see the loneliness on their faces. So we can see that this character kind of sympathizes almost. we can see that the character almost sympathizes for these freaks because this character, our narrator, our protagonist, has also been alone for like 5 years, surviving on their own. So they kind of, even though these monsters are horrible looking creatures, they sympathize with them, which is a nice touch and almost in a way foreshadows or in some way like symbolizes that they are actually a freak and don't realize it apparently. And then, but it's fine. I find that as long as you don't bother them, they won't bother you. And yeah, in the chat here, yeah, there's definitely some unanswered questions here. I assume because it's a short story, they don't go that much into it, but of course, there are these questions. And yeah, this could almost be like a horror book. And then we have this interesting thing about they all walk toward west. However, one question I did have, right, is even by the end of the story, we don't really know why specifically they do this. Of course, we know that there's like the lost city or the human civilization there. But for the people that can't see it, how do they necessarily know to go toward it? So I'm curious if you were to expand upon this on exactly like kind of a clear explanation on why they walk west. I'm curious to kind of like what motivates them. Okay. So now continuing, and then we see basically our narrator sees these kind of pieces that almost look human or at least more modern, or they say the rust on the metal seems fresh. And now the narrator here starts to have this huge hope that maybe the human civilization does exist, which is very understandable and characterizes this person because they've been alone in the desert for 5 years. Of course, they are desperate to find some form of human contact. And yeah, you do a really good job here giving these details. We see like this is a nice job. You do a nice job. We really see the character's internal emotions and desperation, and you do show not tell here by not just saying, oh, instead of just showing that like he's lonely, you really expand upon it. We say, just maybe I might find others. Was there really a chance after so long I could finally talk to another human being to know I wasn't alone in my misery? So these are some really powerful thoughts and emotions that show us and make us really sympathize with this character as well. Like it kind of pulls our own pity because of course we feel bad that this person has been alone. And again, this is the same thing where we see like real actual people. This person even feels like a tear on their cheek as they like find this huge city that finally they're going to find. One small thing to be careful of, you do switch between past and present tense here. As you say, I finally trekked to the top of the mountain, I felt my heart stop, and then we say, I can feel. So it's a really small grammatical thing, but just note that. Continuing. And then of course, we see like the idea of this giant lost city where actual humans are. But then, of course, we have this really shocking plot twist of an ending where the character is shot by the protector of the lost city. It's also kind of we also see this huge dramatic turn of events. And again, using this paragraph to break out from the narrator's monologue. And suddenly we're going back into the present, back into this huge action moment where a bang breaks the silence of the night and this person dies. And of course, this is a really, like a really dramatic way to end it. They don't just say that the narrator is dead. They say the knife is driven through the narrator's crying, bleeding heart. So these really big sensory descriptions that also really pull emotion from the reader. So yeah, great job with this. So of course, if you were to expand more upon this, I would ask questions such as like, kind of questions about how like the society, like the lost city works, and more about what does that look like, and also like how do like view their situation. Are they just trained to kind of kill freaks on sight or something? And yeah, this ending is very intense. And also note, one other thing to note is the question of how this narrator became a freak, because also the question of how does the narrator not really know that they're a freak? Because throughout this thing, I'm assuming the narrator says, I've never run into another human. So the narrator here clearly believes that they are human. Yeah, the narrator believes they're human, and yet they describe the freaks as having like purple skin, wiggling appendages. So the question I had was, if they are a freak, since I'm assuming they were shot by the protector of the lost city, then why did they not notice that they themselves were a freak, or that like why aren't they able to see themselves? Kind of just like a question to consider. And of course, how did the freaks come about? So yeah, overall, this is a really interesting story, and like kind of like a dystopia almost. So yeah, overall, really great job writing this. Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to take a quick break here to do to give you guys a few polls, just really fast for fun. There are just 4 questions here, and I'm curious to see. And since it is the last week of class, these questions are a little more fun, and a little more random, and kind of silly. So yeah, these questions are quite nonsensical, so don't mind that. Yeah, today is the last class since this is a 4-week session. Yeah, some of these questions are quite interesting. Glue. But don't worry. In the future, if you guys can let us know. If you guys would be interested in seeing classes, maybe over the school year or next summer, then yeah, don't worry. Kid Teach Kid will totally continue to host classes like this to help you guys hopefully learn some information. Do cows drink blended grass? I'm pretty sure cows drink water. So yeah, I'm gonna let you guys vote on these pretty interesting questions. And of course, the last question, we have yay, nay, or hey. Choose carefully. This is a very important and valuable question. Okay, I'm gonna give you guys about like 20 seconds or so, and then we'll continue on critiquing a few more stories. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results with you guys. So yeah, this is what you guys picked. Your favorite ice cream flavor was vanilla. You said other for the beverage, potato, and yay. So yeah, there you go. Okay. All right. So concluding intermission here. I'm gonna go ahead and continue. So the next work from you guys that we're going to look at is actually a poem from the writing critique form. It's called Untitled, and that is not because there was no title submitted. It is actually because the title of this poem itself is Untitled. So we're going to look at a few comments on this. And yeah, I think poetry in general is actually a really interesting genre. You have a lot of freedom with it. And personally, I actually like writing poems because they're kind of fun and they can be quite short. Okay. So first, as always, I'm going to go ahead and read this quickly to you guys so you guys can hear it for yourself. Being given a title should be the biggest and most prideful moment of your life. But to me, it is just another weight added to my back. You're expected to live up to your title's name, whether it be the ruler of a kingdom or a popular high school student's reputation. No matter the title, you must live up to it, or you get thrown away as a failure. The truth of this world is much more painful than you can imagine. My title? What is it? I guess you could say I'm untitled. Yeah, I thought this poem was actually quite an interesting topic, first of all. So, of course, from the beginning, we start with this idea that standards can be very pressuring things, right? So I think this on its own, we see like a pretty interesting idea over kind of the glory and fame of it, right? So we kind of have our narrator's take here is that standards are pressuring. So we kind of see that is right off the bat. And nice job here, you give some specific examples. You say like the ruler of a kingdom or a popular high school student's reputation, which makes it clear what you're talking about and also helps us as a reader to kind of understand what you mean by like weight. Because obviously we can imagine the kinds of stress or like the kinds of thing, like a ruler of a kingdom is expected to protect their people and like account for like their citizens, all those things. So we kind of understand that. And continuing on here, we now, no matter the title, you must live up to it or you get thrown away as a failure. And I thought this next part here was quite interesting. You say the truth of this world is much more painful than you can imagine. So this here is quite interesting because I was actually kind of curious on your interpretation writing this, because although I kind of get these, I kind of get the idea that you're saying that it's painful knowing that like expectations lead to failure, but it's kind of like a different take and almost feels disconnected from a lot of the other, from the rest of the poem. So I am curious, this is kind of, again, this is interesting, but we don't really get that much detail on this. Because the way the narrator says this is that it's much more painful than you as the audience can imagine. As the audience can imagine. So it gives this idea that the narrator is almost like all-knowing, like, or not all-knowing, but they have, at least they've gone through things and experiences that the that you as the reader have not. So it gives this idea that they know something, or at least they've been through hardships. So I'm curious if maybe when, if you were to revise this, if you would kind of expand upon what you mean or figure out how to tie it more thoroughly into the rest of the poem. And then continuing here, I really like the way you ended this. I think it's quite interesting. The dots almost give the impression that the narrator is waiting as if listening to the reader's response. And then we say, what is it? My title, what is it? And then I guess you could say I'm untitled, which is a really nice way of kind of bringing this full circle. Because we kind of see, right, because from the beginning, we're talking about how titles are like standards and expectations. And from the end, we can see because obviously we have the impression that the reader doesn't like having these kinds of things. So saying, I guess you could say I'm untitled is a nice way of kind of closing this off. And we get this kind of full circle effect. So overall, really interesting poem and great job writing this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and look at. So this next one is actually quite long. So because of time constraints, I don't think I'm going to be able to critique the entire thing, but I will critique what I can get to and kind of go over and summarize some parts if necessary. Okay. So this story is kind of like a parody almost of like the classic story, the classic fairy tale of Cinderella. So throughout this, we're kind of seeing Cinderella from a slightly altered, different perspective. And we have this in the perspective of two twins. So again, for the sake of time, I'm going to first look at, for example, I'm going to look at, oh, and right, this is by Emma Burgess. So yeah, so this is submitted by Emma. Okay, so I'm going to look at I'm going to choose to look at kind of an excerpt since this is actually, as you guys can see, quite long. So first, I'm just going to just go ahead and start looking from, say, here. So here, I'll read from this section. I went off into the woods to get firewood from the tiny shed that held 100 pieces of wood. I noted this as a good hiding place. I had no gloves. Loretta would never let me have them, so I had many scars on my hands and arms. I gathered the rough wood and stepped out into the early morning. The sun was gently rising in the east, casting a fairy-like glow on the woods and the morning. On the town of Sharnwick, my hometown. I closed the shed door with my feet and started the run home. I took a little detour across the Babylon Creek, and soon I saw the looming mansion where my step-parents lived. I went inside and placed the firewood in the fireplace and lit it with a matchstick that was always by the fire on a little wooden stool. After shutting the iron gate to make sure the fire didn't burn anything, I rushed, stumbling outside to get the mail. My face was hot with soot and ash from the fireplace, but that was no biggie. I opened the mailbox and found 3 letters inside. One was for Mrs. Buchanan, one was a bill, and one was a ribbon-tied fancy letter with the words printed, to the Buchanan family from the Prince and Princess of Sharnwick. I gasped and looked around to make sure no one was looking. When I was sure, I gently started to feel the fine paper when I heard Mrs. Buchanan calling me. Girl, bring me the mail. I sealed the envelope again and said, coming. So from this, basically for context, Leah and Lucas are two twins that are basically serving that kind of represent Cinderella. They are kind of like house servants to a wealthy family because their parents died. So here we see one thing that I would note here. For example, so this sentence here, when we say like, I had no gloves, so I had many scars on my hands and arms. This is a little bit more tell, and I think you can make this a little more show, not tell. For example, this sounds like, basically because of the way this is worded, as if you're just explaining something to the reader. You might want to try something more like from the sheer number of times I've been sent out to do this chore. So like, for example, something like this would feel a little less like an explanation and feels like more like this is the Leah's stream of consciousness as she's thinking and as she's going through with this. Because saying something like thanks for lying the majority of my hands and arms feels a little more show because it's more showing that Leah might notice as she's working and less like Leah is explicitly stating to the narrator like an objective perspective on what she sees. Continuing here, and also I did have the question when she notes this is a good hiding place. If she's done this chore, like I assume lots of times in the past, I did have the question of why she didn't know this as a good hiding place previously, just something to consider. I like a lot of your a lot of your visual description here. We see like the rough wood, right? Early morning, the sun was rising gently in the east, casting a fairy-like glow on the woods in the tone of Charnock, my hometown. This sentence especially has a nice flow to it, and you give great visual details here. It's like a fairy-like glow, kind of these smaller things that add together so we can really visualize this as a reader. Continuing, we have kind of like a sequence of events that follows. We also see some characterization of the way that Mrs. Buchanan, who kind of serves as the purpose of Cinderella's evil stepmother, we kind of see a good sense of characterization. Where we have Leah as kind of like the house servant that's kind of abused, and versus Mrs. Buchanan serving as like this evil, harsh figure from above. And now, one other thing that I thought was interesting, Emma actually switches between three perspectives throughout this entire story. We actually see this here in the beginning, we have third person limited. So we see kind of like from the outside. And then we zoom in and we have Leah and Lucas, which is kind of like a dual first person narrator. So I thought that was quite interesting to see because we get to kind of see like each of the twins and then from afar. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting choice. And I thought it was kind of fun to see those different perspectives. Continuing on here, in this next section, one thing I wanted to point out for the sake of time, and I'm not going to go ahead and read all of this, but we see here from Lucas's perspective, he says, now I grabbed a mop and hummed a tune to this song our mother used to sing called Teacup. It had always been special to my sister and me because our mother used to sing it to us at bedtime. Now that they were physically gone, but the song had settled in with our souls. So this is a nice way of kind of calling back to these people's families because Leah and Lucas have lost that. So in a way, this is like their way of remembering their parents, which is kind of a nice touch to show that they still care about their family. It also makes us, of course, feel sympathy for these people. And yeah, this is also later brought up again when we see here where Leah actually hums the same song to remember her parents. And it kind of works as a way to as a sense of comfort. So yeah, using this here and saying that the song had settled in within our souls. Again, nice use of figurative language there to kind of show the significance of this of Teacup. So which kind of shows their memories of this. And then continuing on, again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to do this whole thing, but basically it is kind of like a parody of Cinderella. So I thought that was quite interesting. I'm going to look at one other section. So near the ending here, one question I did have, of course, this is a fairy tale type story, so the ending is going to have that kind of happily ever after vibe. But the ending, I did have some questions. Emma, when you wrote this, I was kind of wondering a little bit about exactly what they got banned for. And when we say they leaving the twins happy as can be, it kind of feels like too quick of an ending. And generally in stories, we want to feel like a satisfying ending where all loose ends are tied up. So maybe expanding upon this, even just like writing a quick paragraph about where they are now, what their lives look at, where they live, and maybe like how much more comfortable their lives are compared to like the awful like servant-like household they lived in previously. So kind of seeing a more roundabout way of comparing and contrasting their lives previously and now. But yeah, overall, great job writing this. And I think I have time to look at one more quickly. So this is called Bird of Hope. Okay, so we have the trials. That was all, so the trials. That was all Nico could think about for the past week. His chance to prove himself, his chance to discover if he had magic, his chance to join the birds and avenge his parents' deaths. But as he stepped through the door into the small room where his trial would be held, he couldn't help but to be afraid that he would fail. Suddenly, the previously dark room flashed a light, temporarily blinding him. A blinding flash, flames suddenly racing across the walls, the floor, the furniture, his father burning, his mother screaming. Nico shook his head hard. Now wasn't the time for this. He had to focus on the trials. As his eyes adjusted to the bright light, he became aware of the council of wizards standing in a semicircle in front of him. The wizards that he had been hoping to impress for nearly his entire life. Nico Lassiter, one of the wizards told him curtly. We don't want to prolong this with unnecessary formalities, useless flattery, or any sort of unimportant greetings. So we'll keep it short. As you know, you are here to take the trial, which, as you know, if you pass, will allow you to join the Council of Wizards in the fight against the Fury. But of course, if you fail to show an aptitude for magic in this exam. The wizard trailed off, knowing that Nico already knew what failure would mean. His heart pounded as he tried his best to mentally prepare himself for what was to come. Of course, everyone knew that to join the council, you had to be magical in some way or another. But what the test entailed was kept a close secret, and no one dared speak of what they had to do, lest the council find out and kill them for it. He knew that most kids didn't expect to be magical, but everyone wanted to be. They had all heard the stories of the flying monkey who could command wind at will, tales of Blackout, who'd used his power to summon light to thwart the Fury's plans multiple times. And of course, there was the Fury himself, who had been one of the council's strongest wizards, famous for his almost complete control over fire, before he had turned, and before he became a mass murderer. Now the test is simple, the wizard continued, producing a blank scroll. All you have to do is use whatever power is within you on this scroll. This scroll is magical, so it should be able to coax out whatever power you might have. As an example, the flying monkey made the paper levitate in the air. Now impress us. He tossed the scroll to Nico, who barely caught it with trembling hands. This was the test? What the heck did they expect him to do? He'd never before done anything remotely magical, and now he had to do something to this random scroll? He waited, and waited some more, and hoped that something would happen, but nothing did. And as nothing continued to happen, he began to become angry. Angry at himself for becoming unmagical. Angry at the Fury for making him an orphan. Angry at the council for their stupid test. All he had ever wanted was for his parents to be with him again, but because that was impossible, he would do the second best thing and avenge their deaths by killing the Fury. But if he couldn't pass this stupid test, then he knew what would never happen. In anger, he took the knife he always carried from his belt and stabbed himself in the finger. Not enough to hurt too much, but enough to draw blood. And then he began to draw a picture with his blood onto the scroll, barely noticing the small prick of pain caused by pressing his finger on the scroll. When he had finished, the wizards were still watching him in silence. In an angry voice, he screamed at them, You were all supposed to be about justice, protecting the innocent, and where were you when the Fury burned my parents? He threw the scroll at the council, upon which he had drawn a red bird, the council's symbol, using its wings to blow away a large fire. This is what you're supposed to be about, protecting people, but you let my parents die, he roared. You are dismissed, the lead wizard said in a cool voice, barely seeming to register his outburst. Fine, I don't care if I'm not one of you. I don't care if I don't have magic. I don't care about anything anymore, Nico screamed as he turned to leave. But behind him, the red bird he had drawn slowly peeled itself off the page and flapped its wings. Wow, so this is kind of like this fantasy world. This is quite interesting and feels like the start of like a larger picture. We see here, this at the end is a very interesting plot twist where Nico's power is revealed as being able to kind of turn things to life. So this is quite interesting. Since I don't have that much time, I'll just quickly point out a few things. Here, nice job kind of showing the flashback of what happened to his parents in fragments. We see a blinding flash, flames racing across the walls, the floor, the furniture. Those quick details give us a sense of Nico's anguish, how he feels, how much this traumatic event affected him. One question I did have was like at the beginning, he's super desperate to join the birds and avenge his parents' deaths. But then afterward, he kind of yells at them and blames at them for letting his parents die. So it's a little bit of a question of he conflicts between like really wanting to join them and wanting to avenge his parents' death for what they stand for, but also complaining about, or at least accusing them of not helping him. So yeah, overall, this is a really interesting story. I'm curious to see where this goes and where you can take this. And of course, the really interesting idea of like the magic and how the trials test for it. Okay, so really quickly, we have about 3 minutes left, but before you guys go, I'm going to ask you guys to take a student survey. It's been a lot of fun teaching you guys these past 4 weeks. We always really appreciate having feedback on our classes to make them even better for future students. So it'd be really awesome if you could fill out this quick survey. And if you don't have, it'll just take you guys a few minutes. I'll go ahead and paste the link in the chat here. Please fill this out. It'll just, again, it takes pretty short amount of time, and it'll really help us improve the class to hopefully make our class quality even stronger and help even more people. And if you guys don't have time now, I would still encourage you to take time after the class is over to fill it out so that way we can keep improving. So all you have to do is kind of fill out your name, your email. Over here, you just select creative writing for this course. So you can let me know what I can do better to teach this class for you guys and give an overall rating. Tell us what you liked most and tell us what we can change to make this class better. Oh, it's no problem, Andrew. But yeah, no problem, guys. It's been really fun teaching you guys. Hopefully next year we can continue teaching classes. I'll probably even come back and teach maybe something else or continue teaching this class next year. It's been a lot of fun, and you guys have been really awesome students. So yeah, have a great summer, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the class, and bye.